so wonderful to see everybody. And if you want, as you're coming in, do you want to put in the chat now where you're coming from, that would be great. We've got Brooklyn, London, Ontario. I can't even keep up with all of that. Canada. Look at that.
Cork. Pádraig.
San Francisco, Central Canada, North Dakota, all over. It's wonderful to see everybody. Hi, Stephanie. I last saw Stephanie in Iceland, so. Wonderful. For those who are just coming in, I'm just giving it a couple minutes to allow all the people to come in that are in the waiting room. When I used to run Maine Media, and we'd do a welcome every Sunday night, and I would ask people if they thought they came from the farthest away, where were they coming from? And it was just fun to see. Some people thought, Massachusetts was going to be the furthest away from Maine, and that usually was not the case. It was someplace like New Zealand or Australia or wherever. So I am going to get started because as people come in, do a little bit of an introduction first so that I don't take away any time from our amazing program today. So I want to welcome everybody, first of all. It's just so wonderful to see people from all over the world joining us today. It's our third annual conversation about Rilke, hosted by Mark Burrows. And he just does a wonderful job. And I'm just so thrilled to see so many people coming in. And today we have two very distinguished guests along with Mark, Pádraig Tuama and Marie Howe. And I want to welcome the three of you. And before I get going, I just want to say, first of all, about Mark. He's a scholar. He's an award-winning translator of Rilke, a poet in his own right, and a very dear friend who lives in Camden, Maine. How lucky are we that we are based out of Camden, Maine, and we have somebody as distinguished and knowledgeable as Mark, as a neighbor. So, and he's joined today by Pádraig Tuama and Marie Howe, and I think both of you know those names very well, and that's why you're here, to hear them talk about their conversations with Rilke's poetry. And I'm personally in awe of these wonderful poets, and the topic today clearly resonates with so many of us. As we face a world that is besieged by wars, by a climate crisis, and by horrific tragedies that sometimes hit so close to home as the mass murder in Lewiston, Maine last month did for those of us who live here in Maine. And it's at times like these that we reach to poetry and in ways like this to find our peace, in a sense, to find some answers to those questions. So if you are new to the Poets Corner, it was founded in June of 2020 by myself and a good friend, Catherine Seitz, who is no longer able to be involved because of health constraints. But together we were sheltered in, as everyone around the world seemed to be, but we wanted community. So we wanted to create a community of writers and readers of poetry and short prose. And we started hosting these monthly readings on Zoom. And today we have more than 3,000 members from around the world. We host monthly readings such as the one that you're about to listen to today, and they are free, open to everyone, and they're also recorded and available on our website after the event, so you can certainly watch past events as well. In addition, we've started to do a few other things. One is a series of craft talks. So in January, we are offering a 2-part craft talk workshop with the managing editor of the Maine Review about publishing your poetry. And it's a great way to start off the new year. The workshop will be limited in size, and you'll get personal feedback on your cover letter, bio, and if you want, even on a small package of poems, but also on your approach to getting work out into the world. A great New Year's resolution. And in February, Mark Burrows will return for an in-depth exploration of Rilke. For those of you who want more, want to go deeper, and his workshop is called Heartwork. It's a craft talk. For our craft talks, we charge a very reasonable fee, and the value that people receive has always received rave reviews. In January, also, we open our 2024 chapbook competition for submissions. And this competition is a collaboration between the Poets Corner and Toad Hall Editions, a small press in Northport, Maine. And Toad Hall will publish the winning chapbook. Our third collaborator is the Camden Festival of Poetry, and the winner will be announced at next year's Poetry Festival on May 18th. Our judge for this year's competition will be none other than Marie Howe, who I'm just so lucky that she's on tonight as well, and that she will be the one choosing the winning selection for that competition. Many of you might want to plan a visit to Camden, Maine next spring for our second annual Camden Festival of Poetry, where Pádraig Tuama will return as our keynote speaker. So save that date on your calendars. It's May 18th, 2024. So now I don't want to take any more time away from today's program with Mark, Pádraig, and Marie. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark to take it from here. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you, Meg, for the warm welcome and for the generosity with which you host these programs, have done over the years and continue to do. It's a joy to be together with you, with Pádraig, with Marie, and with so many of you from around the world, really, for this celebration of Rilke. Many of you will know that tomorrow would be his birthday, December 4th. And this year, 2023, is the centenary of the publication of his 2 last great cycles of poems, the Duino Elegies and the Sonnets to Orpheus, which really in some ways charted a new direction in modernist European literature, not just German language literature, but European literature. And perhaps that will emerge as we talk today. But our conversation today is really an engaging of the visionary writings of Rilke, his poems. We'll hear excerpts from several of his letters along the way, and really imagining our way into this remarkable person, this remarkable creative genius. I want to begin with a short excerpt from a letter of his to frame our time together this afternoon. Rilke wrote more than 10,000 letters, or at least we have more than 10,000 of the letters he wrote. He wrote in German, but he also wrote in French. And this letter is one of the French letters written shortly, just a year before he died. His death was at the end of December in 1926. And in that letter to Sophie Giac, he explains these, he has these remarkable words. How all things, he writes, are in migration. How all things are in migration. How they seek refuge in us. How each of them desires to be relieved of externality and to live again in the beyond, which we enclose and deepen within ourselves. For we are convents of lived things, of dreamed things, of impossible things. And he closes by saying, all things are prickly with crosses, all covered with inscriptions, all spaded up and shaken by countless daily burials. And yet we are charged with the transmutation, the resurrection, the transfiguring of all things. For how can we save what is visible, if not by using the language of absence, the language of the invisible? And how to speak this language that remains mute unless we sing it with abandon and without any insistence on being understood?
Mhm.
What a marvelous way of thinking about how we might approach Rilke today. That in a sense, he never wanted to write things that people could understand. He wanted to write things that came from his own experience and that somehow moved into the experience of those who came upon them as readers, or perhaps as hearers, hearing these things read. And he was convinced that the challenges that faced him in his day, a century ago, I would say the same challenges face us today, are above all the challenges about seeing how things cohere, despite all that seems to argue against it, how things are held together in some kind of whole. He just called it the whole, das Ganze. And by that, he didn't mean that there weren't problems, difficulties, sufferings, terrible tragedies. He meant that somehow everything belonged to each other and belongs to us, and we to that whole. And our work is to live into that whole in our outer lives and discover it, first of all, within us. It's that sense of discovering that wholeness, which is for Rilke, and I think for all of us, a task of our whole lives. Really, this is a kind of beacon, a kind of guiding North Star that is as urgent, I think, in these days as it has ever been. And what Rilke reminds us of is something so crucial, and that is that to do this calls us to sing with abandon and without any insistence on being understood. Because as soon as you and I try to figure out how people might understand who we are, what we're about, we've lost that sense of mystery that we don't even understand, that we don't even quite grasp. And so today we're going to enter into a conversation with Rilke through Pádraig and through Marie and through my own readings. And I'd like to begin just with a couple of lines from a poem. We may return to this poem later on. But it was a poem from the Sonnets to Orpheus, a late poem of Rilke's. And it comes, if you have that collection, in the second part. It's number 21, one of my favorites. Singe die Gärten, mein Herz, die du nicht kennst. Sing the gardens, my heart, that you don't know. Like gardens poured into glass, clear, unattainable. Waters and roses of Isfahan and Shiraz, sing them into bliss, praise them, each incomparable. If there's any verb, any way of understanding what Rilke was about, it was about finding a way of praising. And he didn't mean that in a narrow religious sense. He meant it from the depth of our being, to give praise for the gift that our life is, and the gift of that life all around us, in the things of our lives, in the other creatures and people with whom we share this earth, and in the entire earth itself. So to join me in thinking about that life of praise, I'd like to turn to Pádraig. I hope is with us. Pádraig, are you here?
I'm here.
Pádraig, welcome. A warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us again this year.
Thanks very much.
I should say just a word about you, and that is that everybody knows you, but what they don't know is that today you're dealing with a very difficult cold. And so I'm so grateful that you were able to find the lemon tea and the courage and the strength.
That's what I told you, isn't it?
So thank you so much. Pádraig, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. It's lovely to be with you, and thanks everybody for coming along. One of the things that strikes me so often about reading Rilke's work is how some of his most well-known pieces, he wrote in these bursts of creativity. And he was in Duino Castle, finishing off what are known as the Duino Elegies. And while he's doing that, he has these kind of overhearings, almost invasions of poems that he's just listening to and he writes down, and they become the Sonnets to Orpheus, written in 2 books, one of which Mark just read. And I'd like to read one of the Sonnets to Orpheus from the first part of that. It's one of the most accessible ones, but what's so interesting about it is that it's an accessible one that points way beyond itself. It almost feels like it's the key to understanding, or one of the keys to understanding what he's doing. It does seem to me that his later work became more and more like a dreamscape, where you're just being brought into the experience of praise of him. The earlier books, the Book of Hours, I mean, Mark and Marie teach these texts, I don't. But those earlier books seem to have more of a narrative. They follow along and they have more of a clarity, and you're able to go, oh, that's what's happening here, that's what's happening here, here's the development there, here's how this poem is working on itself. The later ones seem to be totally different to that, and I find them very moving in the bravery of that and how he does it. So I'll read this. This is number 13 of the first one, of the first book from Sonnets to Orpheus. There's 2. Fullness of apple, pear, and banana, gooseberry. All this speaks death and life in the mouth. I sense. Read it on a child's face when it tastes them. This comes from afar. Is it being slowly rendered nameless in your mouth? Where words once were, discoveries now flow, startled in being freed from the fruit's flesh. Dare to say what you call apple. This sweetness that only intensifies, formed quietly in the tasting to become pure, alert, and transparent, ambiguous, sunny, earthy, here and now. Oh, experience, sensation, joy, immense. I love this poem for what it's doing. It is so sensory. I love the image of watching a child eat a gooseberry. I love gooseberries. I love really sour, tart fruits that sting almost when you taste them. But I mean, I've seen kids try to eat a gooseberry, and it's probably a macabre form of entertainment that I've taken from watching a child eat a gooseberry for the first time. Although I'm always full of admiration for a child that eats a gooseberry and then reaches for another one. I think that was me. But what he does in the midst of this poem that is such a poem of praise, pure, alert and transparent, ambiguous, sunny, earthy here and now, he's pointing beyond the thing. And I love that. So often it seems to me in reading Sonnets to Orpheus, what he's doing is he is trying to write pure sensation. I've been reading some Paul Celan lately, and Paul Celan, a German writing poet who suffered terribly. His family were exterminated in a death camp. And Paul Celan says that poetic technique is just the foothills of poetry. It's, of course, you need to traverse the foothills to get to the summit, to get to the real ascent of climbing up a poem and going into a poem. And it seems to me that in Sonnets to Orpheus, that what it is that Rilke is doing is he has all of this technique, which he's using almost intuitively and beautifully and brilliantly, but also stripping it off. These poems are naked. They're not trying to be in control. They're just giving themselves over to some kind of ecstasy. Again, I'll read it again. That sweetness that only intensifies, formed quietly in the tasting to become pure, alert, and transparent. Formed quietly in the tasting. What does that mean? Formed quietly in the tasting. Narrowing it down to even say that the gooseberry itself, or the apple, or the pear, or the banana, that in itself is also not the thing, that it's the tasting of the thing, and it's the breaking of the thing. And in a certain sense, it's the breaking down of the fruit and the experiencing of the fruit in the mouth that causes something. Here you see something of Rilke's kind of almost ecstatic, maybe naive, but ecstatic relationship to death and presence and absence and nothingness, all being present here in this moment that opens it out. And then he says this great line, dare to say what you call apple. What? Like, dare to say it. And he, like, what you call apple. He's saying this thing is so much more than the name we give it. And with that, I think he's also saying a poem is so much more than the thing we give it. Where is it going to? What can it do? What is the experience? What is the taste of art in your mouth? What is the sourness of it? Where do you want to spit it out? What is happening in you when the poem is breaking down in your experience of it? I love what he's doing here in the audacity of pushing beyond what an apple is, what a gooseberry is, what a banana is, what a poem is, what language is, what a name for something is. I have a friend in Dublin, Anna Hickey, and Anna used to go around the place every now and then and deliberately try to say the wrong thing when he'd see something. So he'd see a tree and he'd say monkey, or he'd see an apple and he'd say machinery. And he would just kind of say, look. And it's actually really difficult to do because you're letting go of things. And sometimes you might kind of see an apple and you go orange, or you might do a very immediate association. But he had trained himself. He's a little bit peculiar, but he had trained himself to just completely free associate with that in order to be able to see what was in front of him and to see that the sound we make with our mouths for the thing is not the thing, that actually it's the thing in front of you. And it might be a monkey, it might be a piece of machinery, it might be a bomb, whatever it is. And he was just trying to see it for what it was and all its power and potency and danger. And I see that this is what Rilke in this poem, and throughout in my kind of paddling in the pools of Rilke, what he is doing throughout the later poems is pointing beyond the poem, is pointing beyond the idea that this poem needs to be understood for its argument, for its conclusion, for its sense. And instead, sense making, he's really suggesting, it seems to me that there's something about the sense feeling that's being put across. I'm going to sneeze in about 30 seconds, I think, so I'm going to hand it back to Mark and Marie. I will say I read Mark's translation there. Mark has a beautiful book coming out next year. He'll be too humble to talk about it, but I love this book. So that was Mark's translation there that I read.
Thank you for such a wonderful musing, pondering, wondering. Marie, on to you. Let's keep this going. You're muted, Marie.
I know. I was saying I know, but I couldn't find it. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Mark, it's wonderful to be with you. Pádraig, it's wonderful to be with you. Meg, it's wonderful to be with you. Bless you for creating this. Every single person here, it's wonderful to be with you. I have tears in my eyes after listening to Mark and Pádraig. I need this so much today. Mark, when you read that things want refuge from externality, I mean, what a thing to say. I've been thinking so much about the inner life, the space within us that nobody can see. That really is where we live. and how I am at least driven out of my inner life hours and hours and hours a day, out, not there. I have errands to do. I have things to think about. I have lists to make. I have people to talk to. And so that it's almost painful to re-enter my own inner life sometimes, because I have been away too long. For me, Rilke is the great poet of innerness, but as Pádraig points out, not in any way in an insular, isolated way. In fact, Rilke says, in the elegies, the springtimes had need of you. The violin playing in the upper window needed you to hear it. Like the things of the world, what we'll call things for now, the creatures, the other animals, the trees, the box, the cup, needed us to give them refuge from their external life and take them within us. He is such a poet of relationship in that way, that through taking in the world into ourselves, not only do we come to some moments of coherence and wholeness, but the world wants that too, it wants to be internalized. The poem I want to read, and I think right now, especially, it's obvious to say this, but I need to say it just for myself. Our culture is so externalized. We have all our dailiness, and then we have Netflix, and we have Instagram, and we've become quite performative. So it seems to me that what Rilke is asking is really radical, and to feel a responsibility to apprehend the world and to create a space within us large enough to hold it. So one of the poems, I fell in love with Rilke in 1975 when I was at Brockport State College, becoming certified to teach high school. And I was in the library. I was lonely. I was in a place I'd never lived before. And I was going through the stacks. And I saw this book, Journal of My Other Self, it was called in English. And I pulled it out and I opened it up, and I heard a voice that felt as if I had known it all my life. And from that moment on, I felt so grateful for his voice and his presence in the world. Like Rilke, growing up as a Catholic, I was very exhausted and frustrated with the sentimentalization of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the way she was treated in most everywhere. And so when I discovered the life of Mary that he'd written, a series of poems about Mary, excuse me, I'm trying to, whoops. I'm really not good at Zoom still, even after all this time. Here we are. So I'd love to read the poem called The Annunciation right now. This is a translation by Franz Wright. I was saying to Mark and Pádraig earlier, translations are so different from each other. I don't know German, and I want in another time to read several translations of this poem at the same time so that we can experience how different it is in different language. But this is one of my favorite poems in the whole wide world. The Annunciation, as you know, is when Mary, unmarried, a maiden, still a person without a family, without an adult role, is visited by an angel who tells her something startling. So here's how it goes. I also think this poem is very funny, witty in a way. It isn't just that an angel entered. Realize this is not what startled her. She might have been somebody else, and the angel some sunlight, or at night the moon occupying itself in her room. So quietly she accustomed herself to the form he took. She barely suspected that this kind of visit is exhausting to angels. Oh, if we knew how pure she was. Didn't a deer catching sight of her once in the forest lose itself so much in looking at her that without coupling, it conceived the unicorn, the animal of light, the pure animal? It's not just that he walked in, but that he placed the face of a young man so close to her, his gaze and the one with which she answered it blended so much suddenly that everything else vanished. And what millions saw, built, and endured crowded inside of her, only her and him, seen and seen, I and whatever is beautiful to the eye, nowhere else but right here. This is startling. And it startled them both. Then the angel sang his song. So I love that so much about the poem. I love that Mary, well, we were talking about Meister Eckhart earlier, and I can't help but bring him up. Meister Eckhart, as you may know, insisted over and over again that our only work was to become detached from all created things and to empty ourselves from created things so that that which is uncreated can flow into us. This strikes me as a constant enunciation if you're able to manage it. And Meister Eckhart also said, perhaps Jesus is the fruit of Mary's enlightenment, which is an amazing thing to say. And then also that each of us can become the mother of God. And I feel like Rilke is not a religious poet, but he is a transcendent poet in that way. And so when he says it's not just that an angel entered, understand this is not what startled her. I just have to laugh every single time I read it. It's so funny. He might have been some sunlight or the moon occupying itself in her room, but she slowly accustomed herself to the shape he took. And what happens? What happens between these two entities? He brings his face so close to hers that he looks at her and she looks back. And in that mutual gaze, something happens. And it happens nowhere else but right here and right now. And it can't happen in the future. It can't happen in the past. It happened in what they see together between them. And it's only then that the angel sings his song, which reminds me of what you were saying, Mark, earlier about then from that, the song comes. The song is not the message. The song is the outpouring of joy. Because it's like those wonderful spy movies where I have half of the key and Pádraig has the other half, and we can only get into the vault, if we both open the key at the same time. And that angel and Mary are like that. They need each other to understand the reality that can only be present between them. All of Rilke's poems concern themselves with our inner lives and what the space we make within ourselves, which doesn't even allow for fantasy or desire, but a kind of absolute receptivity to what is, that allows us to experience the utterly new, something we never even imagined was possible. And I think in this way, of course, he's also speaking about poetry itself, but he's also speaking about living in constant relationship with what we'll call the external, the apple, and taking it into ourselves and having that meeting occur. And from then, singing.
Powerful. Oh, thank you, Marie. Thank you so much. What a marvelous enticement into this mind, this heart, this spirit, this genius of Rilke. Pádraig, let's turn back to you. You had a couple of other sonnets you'd like to share.
Yeah. One One of the earlier ones in Sonnets to Orpheus really struck me because it is that particularly difficult kind of sonnet where you're reading it, experiencing it, and wondering what's going on. Of course, the title of the Sonnets to Orpheus kind of tells us what it is. It's Sonnets to Orpheus. Orpheus, who was with Eurydice, and then she dies and is taken down to Hades, and he goes with his lyre and tries to bring her back, and almost gets her back. If you've seen Hades Town, you've seen it sung on Broadway or wherever it is you've seen it. He almost gets her back, but he turns around just as they're about to exit Hades, and she goes back down. So Orpheus is this tragic character who has experienced death multiple times and coming close to the edge of conquering death unsuccessfully. And he's God, he's a myth. He has this voice that can change things, but yet it can't also. He has to face the limitation. So here is the 13th of the first book of Sonnets to Orpheus. A god can do it.
Wow.
But tell me, how should a man follow him through the narrow lyre? His mind is conflicted. At the crossroads of two heartways stands no temple for Apollo. Song, as you teach it, is not desire, not a courting of what is eventually yet attained. Song is being, something easy for the god. But when are we? And when will he turn the earth and the stars toward our being? This isn't it, young man, that you love, even if your voice opens your mouth wide. Learn to forget that you sang out, for this will pass. To sing truthfully is a different breath, a breath for nothing, a blowing in God, a wind. There's something about that poem that I found myself kind of free associating with it when I was rereading it over the last few days. I found myself thinking about the middle-aged Rilke. He had been writing as a young man. You know, he wrote in 1899 the first kind of extraordinary iteration of what turned into the Book of Hours. And now he's in Duino Castle finishing off these elegies. They've taken years. And while he's finishing off these elegies, he has these two bursts of these sonnets to Orpheus. But it seems to me that it's him in conversation with himself too. It's him in conversation with youth. It's him looking at the limitation. He didn't live much longer, maybe 5 more years. So he died a young man, unfortunately. I wonder what his songs of his older years, or his poems of his older years would be. And he seems to be asking great questions that philosophers and existentialists and phenomenologists were asking around the same kind of time. What is being? You know, song is being, is that what he says? Something easy for the god. But when are we? So interesting. Not who are we, where are we, when are we? He asks the question of time. And it seems to be that this poem is filled with some of the artistic tension that you hear. How should a man follow him through the narrow lyre? His mind is conflicted. At the crossroads of two heartways stands no temple for Apollo. In a certain sense, he seems to be looking to Orpheus and saying, you had it easy, but it's a bit more difficult for us. Part of me thinks, I wonder what Orpheus would write back. I'm not sure Orpheus had it so easy. Orpheus had some difficulty. He lived with this terrible death, and he had this voice that gods would listen to and that hell itself would be stilled by. But he still couldn't change fate, Orpheus. He still had to face the limitation, even of his great giftedness. And so there's something interesting in the way in this sonnet that Rilke is singing to Orpheus, making him into some godlike character. Mark and Marie will be able to talk differently and better about how it is that Rilke's thoughts about who Orpheus was and how that conversation continued. But again, a little bit similarly to how it is in a poem just a few poems later, and some of these poems all came in the one day because he only wrote them in 2 short spurts. I think he said that sometimes as many as 5 came in the same day. So the sonnets to Orpheus were written in a very short period of time. And in the same way that he's saying that the fruit has to be experienced rather than just seen. And in a certain sense, the fruit has to stop being the thing we call the fruit for the taste of it to occur in the mouth, temporary as it is. That seems to be a similar thing that he's saying towards the end of this, which is number 13 in the first book of Sonnets to Orpheus. For this will pass, he says. Or just before that, he says, Even if your voice opens your mouth wide, learn to forget that you sang out, for this will pass. To sing truthfully is a different breath, the breath for nothing, a blowing in God, a wind. There's an abandonment, there's a giving up, there's an abandonment of sense making, but also an abandonment of belonging to one particular mechanism or ideology. It is almost trying to, as Marie said, to transcend sense making. I find these very risky poems, very strange poems. He possibly was risking leaving some people behind who would have wanted other kinds of poems from him, by allowing these poems to flow through him. And I really like it. I think he would have been a difficult person to know. Maybe he would have been magnificent to know, but I think he was so attuned to the changing moment that I wonder what it would have been like to have said to him, let's meet for coffee. Or what it would have been like to have been married to him, or to have been his lover. Marie isn't so sure that it would have been so easy. I think so too. I'm glad for the way within which the muse worked through him, but I imagine it must have come at an extraordinary cost of time, of location, of him being lost to himself while he was being in himself, while he was being in the pure essence of being during all this time. And I think of the demand on the artist in that way, and how important it is to recognize that for some art to come, people have to find the way to be attentive to the changing wind. What does he say in the last line? A breath for nothing, a blowing in God, a wind.
A gust inside a God, a wind, is another translation, right? A gust inside a God, a wind. Don't sing out of desire. That's so radical. I mean, desire is great. Open your mouth. That will open your mouth, but that's not the real song. That's not what's needed.
Yeah, and I think there's irony in that line. You mentioned it a moment ago, Pádraig. Something easy for the god, but of course this wasn't easy for Orpheus at all.
No.
It cost him his greatest love, right?
Yeah.
Was in a sense stumbling with that song at the very moment of triumph. He stumbles and loses what he loves the most, which is such an image of our lives too, every one of us.
What do you mean by that, Mark? What did he lose?
Well, he lost Eurydice at the last moment.
Oh, you're talking about Orpheus. Oh,
sorry, talking about Orpheus, right? At the last moment.
He doesn't stumble. He looks back.
He looks back. No, but I mean, stumbling.
Big difference. Come on, he said, just don't look back, right? Come on, it happens over and over again. Lot's wife, just don't look back, and he couldn't resist. He looked back. Right. It didn't stumble. I mean, I don't mean to be too hard on him. I would have looked back probably too, but we need to look back. And what this is saying something very radical about that, I think. Oh, Carl says Eurydice stumbled, right?
No, when I say that he stumbled, I mean that in that moment of doubt, he turns to see if she's still there. And of course, she has her hand on his shoulder. He should know that she's still there, right? So, man. When Rilke was finishing the elegies, and when the sonnets came, one of his last lovers, a woman he simply called Merline, Baladine Klosowska, had given him a postcard of an engraving from a 15th century Italian, Conegliano, of Orpheus. And he's seated against a tree with the animals have all gathered around him. He's playing to them. But he has a mournful look on his face. It's not a look of joy and delight and reverie. It's the sorrow of knowing that we can't hold the world together in some kind of permanent way, that everything will die. Things will fall apart, including our deepest love.
Well, you said it in a letter, everything's migrating. Yes. Everything's migrating. Everything is changing. We live in the present, but someone's just saying, John, but the present is now it's gone, now it's gone, now it's gone, now it's gone, now it's gone. How does one stand there,
Yeah. Let me read one short little poem and then turn it back to you, Marie, for one. But he, in the same year that he finished the sonnets and the elegies, or published them, sorry, in 1923, he wrote a little snatch of a poem that he never finished, and it was never published in his lifetime. It only came out after his death. And it reads like this. It starts with a strange phrase: we are only mouth. Wir sind nur Mund. We are only mouth. And you wonder with a line like that, as so often in Rilke, what does he mean? We're only mouth. I'll leave that to you to ponder. But the next lines that follow have haunted me since I first read them many years ago. He goes on to say this: who sings the distant heart that lingers whole in the midst of all things? We're only mouth. But who sings the distant heart that lingers whole in the midst of all things? And I think this is his vision of what the artistic life is about. And he doesn't mean this for professional poets or writers or painters. He means this for every one of us. Every one of us is in the search for that distant heart that's within us, but we have to go deep into ourselves to glimpse it, to find its power, and to let that power begin to move us. And that heart, he says, lingers whole, high, in the midst of all things. It's there all of the time in everything that is, but we have to discover it again and again and again.
Like the angel's always there.
Yes.
You know, the angel's always there too. There's when he has a poem about Mary's death, and he says, this isn't the one I was going to read, but he says it's the identical angel, the great one who once brought down the news of her conception, stood there waiting for her to notice him. I mean, I just love that. He just stands there. Who knows how long he's been standing there? Years, days, weeks, but I love that he has the angel stand there waiting to be noticed. And this angel, if you will, is whatever the now might be, because it's there all the time, even as it's changing from second to second to second, it stays the same. I feel like we should all meet as a group once a week and have an hour of contemplation, silent contemplation together. Maybe I would finally be able to sit still. I wanted to read part of a poem called The Temptation. It's interesting. The presentation is what the word is, the presentation of Mary at the temple. And I said temptation, which is interesting. But she's a young girl and she's being presented at the temple. And I just want to read part of the poem. It's kind of long. But again, he earlier, Mark, when you read the beautiful French letter, you talked about the word convent, the convent, the convent of lived things take refuge within us from their how do you say it? Externality.
Externality, yeah.
Externality. And in the beginning of this poem, he gives us a sense of Mary's inner life in a gorgeously thingy metaphorical way. He says, in order to grasp what she was like at that time, you must first remember a place in yourself where pillars do their work, where you can sense stairways, where precarious arches span the abyss of a space which only remained in you because it was built up from blocks that you can no longer lift out of yourself without toppling over. I just have to read that again. I mean, it's like he reminds us that we create our inner space and that these blocks build up this space, blocks that we can no longer lift out of ourselves without toppling. When you are ready, when everything in you is stone, wall, door, view, vault, then try to tear apart a little with both hands the great curtain you have in front of you. There high things give off a light which eclipses your feelings and breath. Which is like, you know, love will open your mouth, but that's not, that's your feelings. You know, Rilke says in another place, you know, in Letters to a Young Poet, poems are not merely feelings. Those one has easily enough. They are experiences, right? Which is new, never happened before. In order to grasp what she was like at that time, you must first remember a place in yourself where pillars do their work, where you can sense stairways, where precarious arches span the abyss of a space which only remained in you because it was built up from blocks that you can no longer lift out of yourself without toppling.
Mm.
When you are ready, when everything in you is stone, wall, door, view, vault, then try to tear apart a little with both hands the great curtain you have in front of you. There, high things give off a light which eclipses your feelings and breath. Upward, downward, palaces rise above palaces. Broader parapets stream out of parapets and reappear abruptly above on such ledges that if you look, you're seized with vertigo. Meanwhile, the clouds from the intense burners overcast the area around you, but the farthest things aim right into you with their rays. And when the light from clear bowls of flames plays on the slowly approaching robes, how can you bear it? So,
What a poem. What a poem. Oh my.
Would you comment on whose translation that was?
this
Marie?
is Franz Wright.
Okay.
Franz Wright made a book called The Unknown Rilke many years ago, like really 40 years ago.
Great collection.
It's a
Yeah.
great collection. Franz loved Rilke and spent so much of his life translating Rilke. And it has a lot of the poems we don't usually find in collections, which is what I love about it too. It has so many other poems.
Can I carry on briefly from that beautiful reading, Marie? Because in the little poem that I read just the first couple of lines, but he goes on to pick up the very same themes that resonate at the heart of the poem, the Mary poem you just read. He asks who sings a distant heart that lingers whole in the midst of things. And he goes on to say, its great beat is parceled out in us in small beats. And its great pain, like its celebration, is too much for us. So we tear ourselves loose from it over and over again, and our only mouth. And there you see it, right? But all at once, he says, the great heartbeat breaks secretly into us so that we cry out, and we are essence, change, and face. And I love that last line, essence and change, which is at the heart of Rilke. We only live in the transformations that our lives are part of. And coming alive means opening ourselves to them, facing them, facing ourselves, not the self we were, or the self we want to be, the self that's changing right now, here.
Nowhere else but right here, he says in the Annunciation. Nowhere else but right here. One of the translations I read, the more rugged one, said, it's not just that an angel entered, realized this is not what startled her. It says something like, when the angel entered, she wasn't scared. And I kind of like that one too. Like, you know, because it is terrifying to live in the transformative. It's terrifying. Every angel is terrifying, as he said in the elegies. It's terrifying, the new, the constantly transformative now. I'd rather watch Netflix for a couple hours. Right?
Is there a
Didn't-
title to the poem you just read, Marie?
Pardon me?
Is there a title to the poem that you just read?
Yeah, it's the presentation of Mary at the temple.
Great. Thank
as a
you.
young girl. Yeah. But the whole life of Mary is in Franz's translation in the Unknown Rilke. And there's, I think, 6 or 7 of them. The Visitation of Mary, Joseph's Suspicion, the shepherds get to be there, the birth of Christ. There's a famous one called the Pietà, the marriage of Cana, and then Mary dies too, which is really terrific, because that's what happens when that identical angel who first appeared to her, he waits for her to notice him, and that's when he's going to say, time to go. And it's very, very tender and very beautiful.
Pádraig, why don't we hear one more of the sonnets from you?
Sure. This is one from the second book of Sonnets to Orpheus, and it's fascinating because he's writing about flowers and the muscle of flowers. Flower muscle is the opening word. It's number 5 in the second book. This again is from Mark's translation that's coming out next July, I think, when it's coming out from Monkfish Book Publishing Company. This is number 5 of the second book of Sonnets to Orpheus. Flower muscle that opens the meadow morning of the anemone little by little, the meadow morning of the anemone, until the bright sky's polyphonous light pours itself forth into her womb, into the star bloom with its muscle flexed with unending reception, at times so overpowered with abundance that the quiet gesture of the sunset can hardly give it back to you, the leaves widely sprung back edges, you resolve and power of how many worlds? We, violent ones, we last longer. But when, in which of all lives will we finally be open and receivers? I think it's an extraordinary volta that he has, but praising this muscle of flower that isn't just, about a beautiful thing, but he's saying like the sun is almost overawed by it. And then he goes beyond just this planet and says, resolve and power of how many worlds? And then the volta, the turn, we violent ones, we last longer. There's such an interesting conversation where he asks the political and the war-making conversation between human beings and our muscles and a flower and its muscles. It's erotic, I think. He speaks about the womb, he's speaking about the body here, speaking about creation. But I find it a fascinating political question that he's asking. And I mean, he wrote this in the 1920s. Europe in the 1920s was devastated. And in 1899, when he had begun what is now known as the Book of Hours, often the last year of a century is a time of thinking of the new, the new, the new. And even in the strangeness of the Book of Hours, he had a sense of foreboding. It was almost like some of the weight of the forthcoming century was coming through what it was that he was listening to. And so for all his transcendent beauty and all of his glorious language and all of his giving himself into pure being and pure song, it seems to me like he also knew an enormous amount about what it was that the human condition could do in terms of violence. He was, his mother brought him up as a girl for a while, and then he went to a military school, which you can imagine must have been heartbreaking for him. He was not predisposed to being somebody who would survive in military school, and yet I think there's something about military school that you see in him where he knows something about what we're capable of, and he has attentiveness to what muscle can be. I think he has huge respect for power, but not interested in violent power. And that's what's so interesting. And he locates that in this beautiful, provocative, political, sensual, erotic meditation on the muscle of a flower, and whether or not that can infiltrate the way that we think of the muscle of humanity when it comes to power.
Can you read it one more time, Pádraig? And people keep asking for the title of Mark's book.
Oh,
yeah,
Sonnets to Orpheus.
Sonnets to Orpheus. And the titles of the poems are all untitled, so they're numbered. This is numbered from the second part, number 5.
Yeah.
And we did put a link in the chat to Mark's book.
Pádraig, read it again, and drop, this is the advanced copy, drop that third line, which shouldn't be there, the meta morning. Just drop the third line in the first stanza.
Sorry.
Read it again for us.
Number 5 of Book 2 of Sonnets to Orpheus, translated by Mark. A flower muscle that opens the meadow morning of the anemone, little by little, until the bright sky's polyphonous light pours itself forth into her womb, into the star bloom with its muscle flexed with unending reception, at times so overpowered with abundance that the quiet gesture of the sunset can hardly give back to you the leaves' widely sprung back edges, you, resolve and power of how many worlds? We, violent ones, we last longer. But when, in which of all lives will we finally be open and receivers?
What a wonderful reading. Thank you. And
Gorgeous.
it's an amazing poem, isn't it? And for Rilke, in the last part of his life, he kept coming back to that image of the open, that our deepest identity is not the things we close off, the things we hold on to, but the way we open ourselves to the beings and the things and life all around us, within us, but all around us, becoming receptive and not achievers or doers or makers, but receivers, really.
He talks about the other animals, how they live in the open. They're open to the open all the time.
Yeah, he has a wonderful image. He says they have, well, he's using it metaphorically. They have God before them and death behind them. They're not thinking about death.
Yeah.
They're living into the
Yeah.
open. We, he says, turn ourselves around. We get it all wrong. We have death in front of us all of the time and God behind us.
Mhm.
God, that creative energy. God, that transformative power within each of us.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, from the 8th elegy. Yeah. Oh my. Can we hear one more sonnet?
Mark, I
read
was
one?
wondering if you might read one more in German as well as in English. I think
Sure.
there's some German speakers on here and a lot of people
Sure there are.
wanting
Yeah,
to hear
let
that.
me read the one I started with at the very outset from the second part. It's number 21, a poem that continues to just shake me. And if you remember those lines I read, he's talking about praising something that you don't know, praising something you've never experienced. And he's writing, I know, he had a lifelong interest in Persia, in ancient Persia, and in the country, the place, today's Iran. And his lover, his first and great lover, Lou Andreas Salome, was married to a Persianist, an Iranist, a scholar of Persian culture. So he'd been hearing about this culture his whole life. He never made it. He got to Egypt, but he never got to Iran. This poem is about how we live toward the things that we haven't experienced and probably won't, which is most of reality for all of us. Singe die Gärten, mein Herz, die du nicht kennst. Wie in Glas eingegossene Gärten, klar, unerreichbar. Wasser und Rosen von Isfahan oder Shiraz, singe sie selig, preise sie, keinem vergleichbar. Zeige, mein Herz, dass du sie niemals entbehrst, dass sie dich meinen, ihre reifenden Feigen, dass du mit ihren zwischen den blühenden Zweigen wie zum Gesicht gesteigerten Lüften verkehrst. Meide den Irrtum, dass es Entbehrungen gäbe für den geschehenen Entschluss, diesen zu sein. Seidener Faden, kamst du hinein ins Gewebe. Wirkum der Bilder du auch im Innern geeint bist, sei es selbst ein Moment aus dem Leben der Pein. Fühl, dass das ganze rühmliche Teppich gemeint ist. So just a word about the poem and I'll read it and turn it over to Marie again. But he's writing these poems in this chateau of Muzot, as he called it, a chateau. It was a tower with a single small space on the first floor where there was place for him to eat and so on. And on the second floor, an almost windowless room, one small window, he had his writing desk, his standing desk in his bedroom. And at that standing desk, he wrote all of his poems. He carried that with him wherever he went because he had such difficulties sitting. Some of you will understand that challenge. And the walls of Musat, I'm sure, were covered with tapestries, perhaps from Persia. I don't know. Because in castles and stone buildings of that era, the only way to bring a little bit of the dampness under control was to hang cloth pieces on the walls. And so at the very end of the poem, you'll hear him talk about the tapestry, tepik, really carpet, but I'm seeing it as a tapestry because it would have looked like that on the wall. So here's the poem. Sing the gardens, my heart, that you don't know. Like gardens poured into glass, clear, unattainable. Waters and roses of Isfahan or Shiraz, sing them into bliss, praise them, each incomparable. Show my heart that you can never spare them, that they have you in mind, their ripening figs, that you mingle with their airs, heightened as if to your face among the blooming branches. Avoid mistaking that there might be privations because of the resolve once made, this, to be. Silken thread, you're woven into the weave. And whichever image you're wonned to, even within, if but a moment in this life of agony, feel that the whole, the praiseworthy tapestry is meant. What a poem. Imagining that each one of us is like one silken thread woven into a complex weave of a carpet, of a tapestry. And that whatever it is that we're experiencing, to take that into ourselves fully as we can, even if it's a moment in this life of agony, and feel that the whole, the praiseworthy tapestry, to sense that each moment belongs to the whole. It isn't the whole, but each moment in your life and mine, it belongs to the whole, is part of that largerness that we can only grasp within us and allow that innerness, as he called it, beautiful translation of that word, Marie, to see that it's part of the whole. Marie, why don't you give us another? Yeah, unmute.
Sorry. As I'm taking in what we've all been talking about, and all the beautiful ideas and images are swirling through me, I was thinking about this poem. It's a prayer, but again, with Rilke, it's God, but I think it's also this other unnameable thing. I mean, even Meister Eckhart says, don't even say God, I mean, to think that for a second we can understand, even apprehend a tiny bit of what this is gets in the way of it. And when he says, pull apart the curtain in front of you. And this is a poem, it's quite fierce, and he's really pulling the curtain apart from himself and from in front of himself. And it doesn't have a title. Oh, in childhood, God, how easy you were. You whom I cannot take hold of now, anywhere. One smiled on the things one loved to have around. They came halfway, and you were already in reach. And now, my God, where should I travel to find you? Where do I enter? What mountain must I climb? If someone asks for you, where should I point? Where is your rustling grove? Where does your animal wander? Where am I to find the fresh water to wash my face and sex? I have never been clean. Where do you reduce the holy things to ash with the fiery radiance of your eye? Doesn't the scent of all our depravities incite your rage? Now, again, I don't think depravity is really the right word. I'm correcting Franz, and Franz is long dead. I'm sorry, Franz, but it's not puritanical. It's something, it's the thing that gets in the way, I think. What are you waiting for? Why don't you change the ravenous to fasters and hurl an angel at them until they writhe in their own blood? Lord, do not be good, be lordly. Refute the hearsay of their praise. Tear down the house, destroy the bridge, unleash monstrosities in the path of those who try to flee. For we're so enslaved to contemptible needs, we go on believing, sorry, for we're so enslaved to contemptible needs, we go on believing in year after year. If someone holds out their hands to us, we think that's what God is. You red night of agony, you firelit sky, you war, you hunger, kill, for you are the danger we're in. Not until we place our dying in you once again, and not simply our preservation, will everything be yours, solitude and intercourse, defeat and exaltation. For the peace you finally bring to come into the world, first you must fall on us, ambush us, tear us limb from limb. For nothing has the power to so utterly destroy us as the way you use us when you want to set us free. It's very different from his other work, but to me, it's what he's talking about is getting rid of all those images we use to keep reality, for lack of a better word, at bay, or the transformational now at bay, and that all of these ideas about that we keep to protect ourselves from that experience have to be destroyed. You are the danger we're in. Yeah.
Amazing poem.
Would you say again the name of that poem, Marie?
It doesn't have a name.
Okay.
It just uses the first line, and in childhood, God, how easy you were.
And it's from the same.
It's from the unknown Rilke. Franz, right?
Pádraig, why don't you carry us another step?
There's something about that I'm struck over and over, and somebody mentioned it in the comments there, about his receptivity and how he kind of uses that as an imperative: be open, be receptive. And like, I'm thinking about this politically. I read some Hélène Cixous, that extraordinary writer who writes prose and politics and philosophy and poetry, and it's overwhelming. She's still alive. She's in her 90s now. And she was kind of responding to many of the 20th century's philosophers who were commenting on, they were kind of saying that the human condition has an existential rejection of the other. And so that there's always going to be the battle with the other. And she, in this audacious comment, and I forget which book it's in, so my apologies, she says, anybody who's taken another person's body into their body or pushed another person's body out of their body has a different relationship with other than these men who are writing. And I thought there was something so interesting in terms of how she was using the politic of the body to speak to philosophy, to speak to sensuality, and to speak to the idea of who is it that gets to say that the human condition is fundamentally antithetical to the experience of the other. And she was saying, maybe not. Maybe saying that makes it. And I think it's a really interesting point of view, but I find myself, especially reading the Sonnets to Orpheus, thinking of Hélène Cixous and Rilke in conversation about this idea of openness, about the radical risk of that, about the danger of it, about the beauty of it, and about what's going to be given birth to through you, in you, by your own death. What are we going to turn into? There's something about that is, what she would call, what Hélène Cixous said, everybody's called to be bisexual. She wasn't meaning that in terms of sexual orientation, but she was really meaning that when it came to the question of how it is you understand, the question of sex, gender, power, and what therefore that should inform you in terms of the way that you live politically and live intellectually and live when it comes to your relationship with power in the world. And I think Rilke, who knew such a lot, like, it was a terrible time that he lived through. in Europe. He knew such a lot, and he still wrote poems like this, and he was not a naive fool. And I think there's something so interesting in seeing that in him, in his assertion to say, be open, be receptive.
We want
Let
we
me
want to hear
let me
people.
follow up with a poem. You read the number 13 from part 1, Pádraig. Let me follow up with number 15, because I think those 3 poems that came certainly within the same day, but perhaps even within the same hour. I mean, he wrote the first 26 of these poems in 3.5 days. They just poured out. He said he heard them being dictated within him. But number 15 carries on that sense of what it means to really open ourselves to the experience of our own lives, right? Of that's there in every moment of every day in each of our lives. It's always waiting for us to open to it. And this poem begins with all of these things that Marie and Pádraig, that you would all tell people, don't do this. Don't use exclamation marks in your poems. Don't use ellipses in your poems. These are terrible. And Rilke does, because he's trying to express something that can't be expressed without this. So in the first 2 lines, there are 3 ellipses, one with 4 periods. And sometimes he uses 5 periods, which is completely ungrammatical in German or in English. But here's the poem. Wait. What a place to start. And it's in the plural. He's telling all of you, all of us, wait, wartet. That's delicious. Already it's on the run. Just a bit of music, a stamping, a hum. Girls, you who are warm, girls, you who are mute, dance the savor of the experienced fruit. Dance the orange. Who can forget it, how drowning in itself, it defends itself against its own sweetness. You've possessed it. It has converted itself deliciously toward you. Dance the orange, the warmer landscape. Throw it forth from within you, so that the ripe one might shine in your homeland's winds. You that glowed, unveil fragrance upon fragrance. Establish kinship with the pure, refusing rind, with the juice that fills the happy one. That sense of finding ways through our own experience, our bodily experience, right? Not just our mental experience, our bodily experience, to sense how we belong to everything around us, that it belongs to us in a sense, and that our life is about opening ourselves to that belongingness. He never used that word, but he might have, to invent a word like that. But this notion of dancing the orange, to dance the orange, it's ridiculous on one level, right? It's just ridiculous. Who can dance an orange? But when you see what he's saying in this poem, how would you put this in other words? I mean, in a sense, embrace this thing that gives itself to you without any demand, that simply gives itself to you. And how do we live our lives? How do you live your life? In opening yourself in that kind of way.
Well, it's like what you read, Pádraig, what you call the apple, right?
Yeah, what you
We
call the apple.
reduce it by naming it. We reduce it to something we think we know, instead of just what we call the apple.
Yeah.
In the line that somebody called out in the chat, dance the orange.
Dance the orange. Where words once were, this is a poem you read earlier, Pádraig, where words once were, discoveries now flow, startled and being freed from the fruit's flesh. I love that. This is a wordsmith. This is a poet who makes his way in the world through words, but he knows that the words are gesturing towards something else, something deeper, something truer, something impossible to hold on to, but worth opening ourselves with everything we have to sense it a little.
I find myself thinking of a line from Kai Miller, whose work I love. He's got a poem called Speaking in Tongues, And he's kind of writing about people who are having the charismatic experience of speaking in tongues. And he's not part of that. He's not kind of endorsing it, but he is also saying, isn't it kind of cool that people can just make noises and let the noises carry the feeling? And he's outside of it, on the outskirts, he says in the poem. And he's kind of defending a religion that he's not part of, and defending a religious experience that he's not part of. And he has this great line in the middle of the poem when he says, "What is language but a sound we christen?"
Mm-hmm.
And
What is
language but a sound we christen?
Hmm.
And I think that is such a fine understanding about that. Noise is just, we have certain accepted noises in different languages that are a vehicle for meaning. But it's just a noise. It's pointing out beyond itself, that in a certain sense, even when I say cup, that is still a metaphor. It's still a vehicle, a vessel for saying something else. That everything is metaphor. And that we are utterly reliant on metaphor. Even when we're not talking formally in metaphor, we somehow are always pointing beyond the very thing that we're talking about. Or using noises to talk about something that can't conjure up the very thing that we're talking about.
Well,
And
in
it
a
seems
sense,
like Rilke was so consumed and carried by that as well.
and we ourselves are metaphor in that sense, right? Yeah, there's
No.
something in us that can never be contained in definitive ways. We explode the boundaries of our own being. This is Rilke's whole notion of what life is. That's why he said we live in the changes, in the transformations. We live in the energies of flow that are coursing through us all the time, at every moment in our lives.
You
I
know,
won't be still, he writes in an early poem, until I've attained this, to find images for my transformations. That was a poem he published in the early 1900s in the Book of Hours, written in 1899. But I think he spent his whole life really trying to work that out, to find images for his own transformations. And that's why we keep coming back to Rilke, because he invites us to find images for our transformations.
I love how
we'd
much
like to
you all
hear
talked
from
about.
people.
Yeah, I've talked about taking away the curtains, but I do want to let people know, a lot of people were asking about the names of poems or the books that you read from, and we'll send out a list of all that afterwards to everybody that's registered. So you can rest if you missed it in the chat or missed somebody saying. There was a question very early on, and I think it was repeated a couple of times, about translation, and it's come up a lot. And maybe, Mark, you could speak to the number of different translations and a little bit about what that struggle is to translate Rilke.
Well, I mean, somebody once famously called translation the impossible art. And, you know, if you really ask me how should you read Rilke, the obvious answer is learn German. I mean, learn German well enough that you can read him, but that's not possible for many of us. And indeed, there are so many people writing in so many languages, we could never learn them all. So we're dependent on translators. And in some ways, because with a poet, as a lyric poet like Rilke, the challenge of every translator is to stand before a poem that is sometimes utterly gorgeous, and to find a way of rendering it so that the experience of that poem, if you're a native German speaker, when you read that poem, that the experience is the same one for the English reader when they read the poem in English. And of course, it'll be a dim approximation always. But one thing I will say about translating Rilke that's so hard is because he's not just a lyric poet. He's also a daring craftsman with language. And he does things with German that are impossible. He makes words up that make no sense. He makes verbs into nouns that don't exist, and nouns into verbs that didn't yet exist. And he creates words as German can as a language. So how do you translate that? Difficult. And so one bit of advice from me, and I think Pádraig and Marie, you can chime in on this too. If you're reading Rilke and you're dependent on translations, get several of them. Get 2 or 3 of them and have them in front of you. And listen to the conversation between the translations, not just the translation of the poem in English with the German poem, but the translators with themselves, with each other. That's a helpful tip.
And
I would
are
say.
there some translators that you recommend aside from yourself?
Well, you know, when I proposed to a publisher to publish a new version of the sonnets to Orpheus, the immediate response was, why another one? Because there are probably 15 in print right now, and there have been probably 25 in English over the last, 70 or 80 years. First great one, really, from in the 1930s, Leishman's translation, followed by Herta Norton. It helped that her husband was a publisher and it got into print right away, but it's still one of the finest, I have to say. So in some ways, a translation has to make its own case, and you have to listen to it, and you have to see if you trust it, and you have to see if you can follow it. So I won't say which one is the right one to read. There's some I like more than others. There's some that I memorized in English as I was learning German as a boy, as a young person, I should say, that I still have in my mind. It's very hard to translate those poems because I still have Bly's translations in English emblazoned in my memory. And they're magnificent translations. They're often quite far from Rilke, but they're magnificent translations. Just as poems, they're remarkable.
And someone is asking about recommendation for a biography of Rilke.
We'll put that in an email that follows. There are several good ones, and there are a couple I would probably avoid, but we'll put that in an email to you tomorrow.
That's great.
I want to. We're almost at the end of our time, but
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Marie, and Pádraig for an extraordinary hour and a half. This has touched not just me, but touched so many, so deeply, for your honesty, for your depth of reading, for the feeling that you bring, not just to these poems, but to us in the way that you've embodied them and shared them, opened them to us. My deep gratitude to both of you.
Well, I have to second that. It couldn't be said more beautifully or graciously, Mark, but I would also extend my thanks to you for bringing us all together and bringing us your depth of knowledge and your passion for Rilke in ways that just opened my eyes and my heart. And I know it did for so many people on here today. So thank you. And for everybody who showed up today, thank you for coming. We will follow up with an email more about a follow-up workshop with Mark, Craft Talk with Mark in February, and some recommendations for reading. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark,
Thank you,
Meg,
Audrey.
and Marie, and everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for being here.
What a treat.
What a precious, precious time. Thank you all for making this so extraordinary. And first of all, Pádraig and Marie, thank you to you.
Yeah, we
Oh,
can.
and Pádraig, thanks for showing up despite the cold. Take care of yourself.
I hope I'm muting myself often enough. I think once I forgot. My apologies.
You were just fine. And Marie, I had, you just opened up my mind to so many aspects that I hadn't heard before. All those poems, the poems about Mary.
Mm.
Amazing.
Here's another